Hi guys, and welcome to the mothership, and welcome to another video. So in this video we're going to be looking at something called VirtIO FS, which stands for VirtIO file system, and we can use this to connect various locations on the Unraid server to a Windows or Linux VM. And in this video we're going to be looking at it in relationship to Windows VMs and comparing it to other ways of connecting to data on the server, such as vdisks and network shares. So, is VirtIO FS ready for the prime time? Let's find out. So, like I said earlier, VirtIO FS stands for VirtIO file system. And basically, what this allows us to do is to connect any location on the Unraid server and have it appear as a physical disk on the VM. Now this can have some advantages and disadvantages, as we'll see, but it basically allows us to connect to any location on the server. It doesn't have to actually be a share, so it doesn't have to be shared by Samba or NFS. It's kind of a bit like its own share system itself, which you specify inside the VM. And this is really easy to do now in Unraid 6.11. Because it's been built into the Unraid VM manager, we can do it straight from the template. So what we're going to start off with is having a look at it in action, trying to look at its both advantages and disadvantages, and comparing it with other ways of connecting data locations to VMs, such as using additional vdisks or just regular network drive. Anyway, let's move across onto the Unraid server and get started. Now the first thing to do, I think, is just make sure you upgrade your Unraid server to the latest stable version. Now VirtIO FS got added to the Unraid VM manager in 6.11.2, as we can see here in the Unraid release notes. Now 6.11.2 is no longer the newest version. As of making this video, it's 6.11.3, so I'm going to update to that now. And to update, I'm going to go across to Tools, Update OS, and update to the latest current stable version of Unraid. So because I've updated the OS, I need to reboot the server. Okay, so now I'm on the latest version of Unraid. So before we just go and jump in and look how to install this into a VM, let's do a little bit of testing first. Now currently the computer I'm making this video on is actually a Windows VM with an RTX 3080. It's got these 3 vdisks attached, which inside the OS show up as physical drives. And also it has a mapped network drive, which we can see if we go across to shares, which is this share here, the one called Games 2, which has got 9 terabytes of free space, and at the moment there's nothing in there. Okay, so I'm going to minimize this screen, and here we are on the desktop of the VM. Now if I go to the file manager here, you can see here these are the 3 physical disks, which are vdisks. This D drive here is just a USB card reader I've got plugged in at the moment. And here's the map network drive, that game share, with nothing in. Now obviously on a VM you can install anything you want into a vdisk. And depending on where the vdisk is stored, whether it's on like an SSD or just on the regular array, the read and write speeds to vdisks are really fast. So if that's the case, you might think, well, why bother writing data anywhere else? Well, a vdisk has its limitations, in that it's just one physical file on the server, and so it can only be accessed by a VM when the vdisk is attached to the VM. Well, actually that's not 100% true. I made a video a while ago about how to access a vdisk from the server itself. It's a bit of a pain, and it's not particularly easy. But if you want to see how to do it, then watch my video here. And with the vdisk, it can only be accessed by one computer at a time. You can't access a vdisk with multiple VMs. It can only be attached to one thing at a time. Another thing to think about a vdisk, because it's only a single file, if that file somehow became corrupted, it's pretty unlikely that it does, but if it was to become corrupted, then you're probably going to lose all of the data that's on that vdisk. So of course we should back up our vdisks if we've got important data on them. But if you look at my G drive, the games drive here, I've got 399 gigs free out of 499, so only 100 gigs are used up. So if this vdisk was a raw vdisk, then copying this vdisk, it would take up 500 gigs in the backup location, even though only 100 gigs are used. Now this isn't the case if you use QCOW2 vdisks. I prefer QCOW2 myself. I'm not really going to go into the differences between QCOW2 and RAW, that can be for another video, as tempted as I am to talk about it now. So obviously we can install things and put data on network drives, which are basically map shares on the host server going to the VM. The advantages are data that's placed here is going to be safer than it would be in a vdisk, and this data can be accessed by multiple computers at the same time. Now the downsides are the read and write is going to be a little bit slower going to a network drive, even if it's on an SSD, just because of the overheads that Samba imposes in its working operations. Although I think we'll run some tests testing that and see what the actual speed difference actually is. Another problem is some applications and programs you can't actually install onto a network drive, which can be a bit of a nuisance. And I'll show you an example of that by trying to install this here, the good old Games Galaxy Web installer. Now if we go through the installer and go to browser location, well, we can only see the physical disks here. So why is that? Well, basically this program's running in elevated privileges. And what I mean by that is running with higher privileges than the local user that I normally log into Windows with. If I open the file browser here, we can see I've got a Z drive here, but it's not showing here. And that's because of Windows' UAC, user account control, network shares, with a normal user account and an elevated account being kind of shared together. And I can show you that if I open CMD here and just run that normally as my normal user, and I run the command net use, then I can see that this network drive is in use. Now again, if I go to CMD, but I run it as administrator and run the same command as an administrator, I can't see any network drives. So basically, that's what's happening here. So like I say, some programs don't install on network drives. Now there is a workaround when it's this reason they don't. So an easy solution to try is to make the map network drives to be linked. And I've done a video about that years ago, I think, and I'll link to it in this video in case you want to check it out. So I'm going to make the change now and link the network connections, and then I'm going to try and install it again. Now the install here is going to be really sped up because there's no point you just watching through in real time. Now I want to do this because I want to compare the difference between installing on the network drive and then installing the same program on a VirtIO FS target. Okay, it's installed and I'm clicking on run. Now from here it's really slow opening up. It probably took between 40 and 60 seconds, I'd say. So very slow. Normally when I install programs on the network drive like Steam games, I don't get this kind of wait at all. So obviously this program's not happy running on a network drive. So I'm hoping for better speeds when we try it with VirtIO FS. Now before going on and installing VirtIO FS on this VM, let's just do a few speed tests just transferring files over the network so we can make a comparison after VirtIO FS is installed. So obviously we're going to need a stopwatch and we're going to need some files to actually transfer. So I've got two folders here, one which we'll use for the speed test for the SMB share and one which we'll use for the speed test for the VirtIO share. Now they're both exactly the same as you can see here, same amount of files, same size as 50 gigs. And having these two separate folders for the two tests we're going to do basically makes sure that everything's going to be correct, there's going to be no file caching, everything will be the same for both tests. And the contents of these are made up of both small files and large files. We've got this folder here, this Adobe folder, which has got loads of little small files in it. And as well as small files, obviously there's big files like this 20 gig Aliens movie here. The rest of the contents are just medium-sized files such as smaller video files and a bunch of photos. And the reason for all these different file sizes in the 50 gigs we're transferring is because different size files transfer at different rates. Lots of smaller files are always a lot slower than one big file. Now in our first SMB file transfer test that we're doing now, that's in this game share here, although there's no actual games in there. Now for this test, the actual location of where this share is also important. If we have a look here, we can see that it's on the SSD cache, which is a regular SATA SSD on the Unraid server. I've switched the Docker service off so it's not possible for any containers to write to this location during the test. I have a separate location which the VMs use, an NVMe pool, where all the vdisks are stored. So for these tests, basically the files will be moving from an NVMe pool over to an SSD. Right, so let's start the first test. Now of course I'm going to keep everything really sped up And in the first part of the transfer, where the speed is quite slow here, that's because it's transferring all of the smaller files. And we can see because it's transferring small files, it's judging that by this speed it would take about an hour and a half to transfer everything across. Now here we're beginning to move into the kind of medium sized files and the speed's going right up. And now right here is where it starts transferring the bigger Aliens movie, the 20 gig one. The speed's right up at 1.1 GBs. So you might be thinking, well, how is that actually faster than what a regular SSD can write at? A SATA SSD won't write that fast. Well, now you can see that the speed's actually dropping down to about what the speed of the actual write speed would be to that SSD. Now you might be wondering, how was that possible? What gave it that kind of real bump in speed? That's because that first fast bit was being written actually into RAM before Unraid then flushed it out onto the actual drive where it's going to. Okay, so we're coming up to the end of the transfer now, and it's finished in 3 minutes 7 seconds. Okay, so now I'm going to delete the folder we just copied across, and now reboot the VM, and then when it starts back up, I'm going to copy the data from the server back to the VM. Okay, so let's do that now and see how long it takes. So through the network share, copying back the other way from the server to the VM. It's a little bit slower, taking 5 minutes and 3 seconds. That's all the tests finished using network shares. So before we install a VirtIO FS drive and test that, let's do some file transfer tests on vdisks, and then we can make some comparisons. Okay, so we're going to transfer this folder here. Again, exactly the same size, it's 50 gigs, same files inside. Now I've just created a vdisk on the cache drive here. So I'm going to go ahead and format that now. Okay, let's move this down a bit. I'll change its drive letter and label. Okay, so here's the drive. Let's bring back up the stopwatch and see how long it takes to copy. Again, this VM is on an NVMe, and it's copying from an NVMe vdisk onto an SSD vdisk. So let's see if it's any quicker than over SMB. Now we can see here the speed is kind of fluctuating, and then it suddenly comes to a dead stop and continues again. This is because of the vdisk cache mode. By default it's set to write back, which is using both host page cache and disk cache, hence why we're seeing these ups and downs. Okay, so we can see that's pretty fast. It's finished in 2 minutes 13 seconds. Okay, so I'm going to run the same test again, but this time I've changed the cache mode from write back to none. This mode disables the host page cache, so we'll see a bit more stable speeds. So other than the spike at the beginning, the speed's pretty consistent, probably about the right speed of what my SSD can do, but overall the speed's slightly slower at 2 minutes 17. Now let's do the same test using VirtIO FS. But first we have to see how to install that. So let's go across to the Unraid server. Okay, to set up VirtIO FS, there's two things we need to do. We need to make some changes to the template on the Unraid side, and we need to install some files inside the Windows VM. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to settings here, then VM manager, and I'm going to download the latest version of the VirtIO drivers. Now please don't skip this bit thinking you've already got some VirtIO drivers. It's important to have the latest ones, which will be the one at the very top of the list. So I'm going to click onto download here and wait for that to download. Okay, so that's downloaded now. So now let's go across to the VMs tab here, and first I'm going to just set up a new VM. Now setting up a new VM is very straightforward. We set up the VM as normal, but then we scroll down underneath the section in the template where we see the vdisks. Here we can see the Unraid share mode, saying here VirtIO FS mode. Now it's currently set to manual, and when it's set to manual, we can choose the location that we want to push through to the VM. I could choose this unassigned disk if I wanted to, and then we give it a mount tag, which is basically a label for the drive. I could call it something like games. If you want to automatically just choose a share for this, on the drop down list here, you'll be able to see all of the shares on your server, and I can just click this one here, say games 2, and that will automatically fill in the mount tag with the name of the share. So with that done, you scroll down to the bottom and then click on to create, and the VM will be ready to go. Now it's slightly different if you've got an existing VM. Now with an existing VM, if I open the template here, and I scroll down and go and do the same, I add that same location here as a VirtIO FS target, but when I click on update, I'm going to get an error. We're told here that VirtIO FS requires shared memory. So just click onto OK, scroll back up here, go across from form view to XML view, and we're looking for line 11 to 13 here, where we see the memory backing. Delete that out and paste this here, which I'll put in the description of this video, and click on to update. Now we just need to go back into the template one last time, go back to form view and scroll back down, put back in the location. Now before we go down and click apply, because this is an old VM, the VirtIO drivers aren't the ones that I just downloaded. Because I created this VM a while ago, the default VirtIO was different then, so I'm going to choose that new one which I downloaded here. So I've got the latest one in the VM. So now I can scroll down, click update, and start up the VM. Okay, so I'm booted up into the Windows VM. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to install something called WinFSP. So I'm going to open up a browser here, and I'm going to type in winfsp.dev. Now there'll be a link for this in the description, and once here, click on to download. Download the installer here, and once that's done, run the file. Just go through the installer, leaving everything as default, and once you've done that, click on to finish. Now the next thing we're going to do is go to the device manager, and now because this is an existing VM, I'm going to have the drivers already installed because I've installed the VirtIO drivers before. So if it's an existing VM and you've installed the VirtIO drivers, find the VirtIO FS driver here and click uninstall. Make sure to tick delete the driver software for this device. Click on install. Now come out to action, click scan for hardware changes, and we can see now we've got this mass storage controller here. Okay, so now we need to go to File Explorer, this PC, and here's the latest VirtIO drivers here. So I'm going to click onto that. I'm going to scroll right down to the bottom, and I'm going to run this x64 file here and install all of the latest drivers. So as well as installing that missing driver, it should update my other drivers as well. Okay, so that's done, and let's reboot. Okay, so when we installed the VirtIO package earlier, it will have installed the actual service to run the VirtIO FS, but there's something we need to do to it first. So just go to the services by typing services and clicking on the app, and just highlight any one of these and then press the V on your keyboard, and you're looking for this here, VirtIO FS service. Now if I go to properties here, we can see the startup type is set to manual. We need to make that automatic, and click apply. Now dependencies here, how this service has been installed, it's been installed with no dependencies. I think it's better to actually have a dependency being the WinFSP. Now we can't add that from here, so what we need to do is to type cmd here and run the command prompt as administrator, and then type in sc space config space then the name of the service, which is VirtIO FS svc, then a space, then depend equals, then we need to put the name of the WinFSP service, which is winfsp.launcher. Now again, I'll put this in the description so you can just copy and paste it to make it easier. And we're told here the service change has been successful, so that's good. We can just double check by coming back here, going to properties, and now on dependencies we can see that this service is dependent on WinFSP. Now the service isn't running at the moment, so we can start that. And now with the service started, when we go to this PC, we can see here that the VirtIO FS file system has been mounted. Now one strange thing that I noticed, if you shut down the VM, and when you first start it, for some reason the service doesn't always seem to start automatically, even though we set it to be automatic. But if we actually just restart the VM without shutting it down, on a restart the service seems to work fine. And you can see with the restart everything's fine. Now if anyone knows why the service always starts on a restart but not necessarily on a cold boot, I'd really love to know, so if you know then please say so in the comments below. Okay, so now let's run the tests. So I'm going to shut this VM down and switch back to the VM where we ran the tests over the network shares, and run the VirtIO FS tests on that to keep things consistent. Okay, so the original VM has booted back up. So now let's try and install that same piece of software, the good old games installer. but this time installing it into the VirtIO FS location as opposed to a network share. So let's just go to the File Explorer and have a look at the file system. And here as before with the 3 vdisks. And here now that share is connected by VirtIO FS. And if I go inside, we can see there's nothing there. So let's minimize this window and run the same installer again. Okay, so accept the agreement and let's browse for a location again. And now we've got this location here. We can install into the Z drive. So I'm going to click onto OK and next. Now it's important to note that I'm getting this warning here. It's saying that it might not install properly because the volume's not formatted in NTFS. So it's warning us because of this that we might have problems with the install or running the program. But of course we're going to continue installing anyway, but let's speed up this bit so you don't have to watch it install. Okay, so it's installed now. So now I'm going to try running the program and unfortunately it's not going to work. We're getting this error saying that the side-by-side configuration is incorrect. So this could be for a number of reasons. It could be to do with file permissions, but what I think is most likely is the fact that VirtIO FS is a case-sensitive file system. And so why this can be important is say the installer writes some files that are dependent on the program running. For example, program.dll, but it's spelt this way. Note the capital letters for the beginning of program and the capital letters for DLL. So now let's say the application calls for the file program.dll, but it's spelling it this way, all lowercase. Well, when the application asks for that from a case-sensitive file system, it's going to say, well, that file doesn't exist, it's not there. Because the lack of capitalization in the file name means it's 2 separate files. So to a case-sensitive file system, the file here that's being asked for, well, it doesn't exist. But if the file system wasn't case-sensitive, then it would just return the file with the capitalization in, because those 2 files would be exactly the same. So sometimes programmers will accidentally make little mistakes like this when they're writing the code. You can't say it's really sloppy programming, because the application's running on Windows and it's expecting to be running off an NTFS drive, which is non-case sensitive. Now of course I can't say for sure that this is the reason why this program isn't installing on the VirtIO FS drive. But I can't think of any other reason why it wouldn't. But if you know why or you've got any ideas, then share your thoughts in the comments below. Now if we go across to the Unraid server, go to the shares and to that same location, we can see that everything's installed. So an interesting thing to try would be to also mount this as a network location. The Y drive will do, and then try and run it over the network. Okay, there's the file there. So if it runs like this, it means that the VirtIO FS installed all the files correctly. So writing the files was no problem, it's just reading them back and using them, that's where the problems are occurring. Okay, so yes, it is running over the network again. So this proves the files were written correctly, it's just reading them back, not working properly. What a shame. Okay, and for our final test, let's do some file transfer speed checks. Let's see how long it takes to copy the same data into this VirtIO FS drive here. And we can see here, it's the same 50 gigs of data. So let's copy it across and see how long it takes. Okay, so the speed of the transfer is rather interesting, I think. At its fastest, it seems to be bouncing between 120 and 125 megabytes per second. And so why is this interesting, you may ask? Well, 125 megabytes per second is about the fastest theoretical speed you can transfer over gigabit Ethernet. Because as I'm sure you know, to find out the fastest speed we can get over gigabit Ethernet, we divide it by 8. And that gives us the speed in megabytes per second. So it seems a bit of a coincidence we're getting these speeds. Is the VirtIO FS driver somehow limited to what the speed of a gigabit Ethernet adapter would be? I don't know. So you might be wondering why when I transferred over the network I was able to get higher speeds than a gigabit Ethernet adapter. That's because the VirtIO adapter is actually much faster than that. I think it's about 10 gigabits. And of course I wasn't going through the real network, it was just a virtual network from the host to the guest VM. Okay, so the transfer's finished. Yeah, it's pretty disappointing. Nearly 8 minutes. Okay, so I guess we better check the transfer the other way. from the server onto the VM, but it's going to be slow again. Okay, so back the other way, the speeds are kind of bouncing around the 80s, in between 80 and 90 megs. And the transfer speed, a disappointing 11 minutes 25 seconds. Okay, so is VirtIO FS on Windows ready for the prime time? No, definitely not yet. Now I could forgive the slower transfer speeds if I could easily just install things and run things through a virtio FS drive, but we must remember this is in very early stages on Windows, and we can take some hope looking at the Linux version because it runs really nicely on that with really good transfer speeds. So I'm sure as virtio FS on Windows becomes more mature, it's going to turn into something really special. Now there's one thing you might want to use virtio FS for as it is. Maybe you have a location, a share, on your Unraid server which you don't want to have accessible by the network at all, just to be 100% secure. Well, if you needed to connect it to a Windows VM, you could use this method. But for the time being at least, I'm going to be sticking to my map network drives on all of my Windows VMs. So I think that pretty much wraps this up. That brings us to the end of this video. Now, I really hope you liked this video, guys. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, give it a like. It really does help the channel when you do that. And if you think anyone else might be interested in the video, please share it with them. If you're not a subscriber, well, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you can know when I release new videos. Now, to all of my awesome supporters and Patreons out there, thank you so much, guys, for supporting me. Without you guys, I really wouldn't be able to make these videos, and I really do appreciate your support. Anyway, guys, it's time for me to go now, but whatever you're up to for the rest of the day, I hope it's good, and I'll catch you in the next video.